guys. Last night at 5:29, I get a text. Hey, Ron, this is John. I wanted to see if you were able to fill in for me tomorrow morning. I'm sick and I won't be able to preach. Now, if he had sent that 10 minutes later, I'd have been out the door because we went to Florida last night to see a Christmas play. So I told him, let me check a couple of things, and I'll get back to you in a few minutes. I had to sit down and think this thing all the way through. And then I went back and said, I can do it. Refresh my mind. What time does it start? He said, thank you. I appreciate it. Service starts at 10. And I'm here. So thank the Lord for that. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak here once again. I'm sorry John's sick. Kind of. I'm sorry I didn't choose a Christmas message for today. I've got about 150 in my file at home that I've used during December each year, and I thought I just don't have time to go through there and find one that rings my bell, so I'll say, well, I'm going to do this one, then have to bring it up to date and rewrite it and type it and all that. No, they're going to get stuck with one I've used before. Not here. I went back. I've got a record of every church where I've spoken, and I've got down each sermon that I've preached in that church. So I looked at, nope, you haven't heard this one, so that's good. I want to talk this morning about the importance of your shadow. One Sunday morning in 1865, a black man came into a very fashionable high society church in Richmond, Virginia. Well, during the service, when it was time to have the Lord's Supper, and in this particular church, they come forward and there's a railing altar, I guess they call it, in front. People come up, bow down, and they're given the communion and then go back to their seats. Well, it was time for communion, and the first one up was this black man. And he walked on down, bowed down at the altar to take of the Lord's Supper. But you could hear this rustling all over the congregation, a pretty good-sized church. And you could hear moaning and groaning and everything. And you see, in that church, they only had one cup. Everybody partook out of the one cup. And these folks didn't particularly like doing that with a black man. By the way, at Ingraham, they were a two-cupper church years ago, and we still had those cups that they would use at communion time. But anyway, about that time and hearing what was going on, there was a man who suddenly stood up, and just a member of the congregation, and he stepped forward, he walked down, and knelt right beside this black gentleman. Well, it wasn't very long after that, one by one, people started getting up and coming down front to partake of the Lord's Supper with this black man. You see, the man that got up and walked down front was a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee had quite a shadow. It went far and wide. It was respected. It just followed him wherever he went. He made a difference. Now, I could tell you a lot of stories of Christian men and women and businesses and churches that had the courage to step up and do the right thing when other folks probably wouldn't have wanted to do what they did. Now, I want to know, have you looked at your shadow lately? Have you taken a good look at it? Sometimes we hear that somebody did something shadowy, or they did a shadowy deed or something like that. That's negative, and that's not what I'm talking about. I want to stay totally positive this morning as we think of our shadow. I read this article not too long ago, and I wish I'd have written it because I like it. But let me read this to you. It says, how many people have you come in contact with today or in this past week? Did you have an effect on anyone? What was it? Did your smile put them at ease? Did you yell and put them on edge? Did you speak with acceptance? Did you uplift their mood? Did you help them believe in themselves? Or did you degrade them and make them feel like less and even destroy their self-confidence? Human contacts shape our lives. The impact we leave matters. Doing things without thinking, without realizing, or as a cultural habit, it does not change the effect. Be conscious of the impact that you have on others. I like that, and that's pretty good advice there. In Acts chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, it is a story there about how the apostles were using their God-given gifts to heal people. God blessed them to be able to do that. I wish I had that gift. Oh, many, 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 many times. I wish that I had the gift of healing. They did. And when they would do that, heal someone, well, they definitely had a good impact on that person healed. But it didn't stop there, because the loved ones of that person, they were affected. Their neighbors that were there, they were affected. Strangers that just happened to be going by and see what happened, they were affected. It says in verse 15 of that chapter, it says, as a result, people brought the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and mats, so that at least Peter's shadow might fall on them as he passed by. Now, some commentators on the scriptures there, they say that no, his shadow didn't do anything. It didn't heal anybody. But then you see other commentators said, oh yes, that God somehow used Peter's shadow to actually heal people if it touched them as they walked by. Some would say, well, he didn't really heal them, but he changed their mind, and they had a new expectation. Instead of an expectation of being sick, they got an expectation of being well, and it worked. I'm guessing most of you remember, not all that many years ago, a guy by the name of Oral Roberts. Now, Oral Roberts, he claimed to be a faith healer, and he claimed to heal various people. Well, here, when he did that, some have suggested he was a good talker. And, you know, you can make yourself sick. Every one of us has the power to make ourselves sick. If our thoughts change and turns into negative thinking, and it just builds and builds and builds, we could be perfectly healthy, but our minds will make the body sick. We can do that. Well, some say that's what Oral had a gift of doing. People came to him who really weren't sick, but yet somehow or other they got the idea that they were, and he had the ability of talking to them and getting them to change from negative thinkers to positive thinkers, and in several it actually worked. Well, could be. I remember several years ago reading several different times, several different studies that said that 80% of the people who were in the hospital at that time really didn't need to be there. They just got it in their head they needed to be, and they talked to the doctor and letting them stay, and a lot of doctors did that. Down through the years, I don't know how many people do. I need to be in the hospital. Well, maybe, maybe not. But they ended up in there, and, well, you know how it went. But it's interesting to me, the insurance companies read those studies, and they did some studies of their own. They came to the same conclusion. They hardly will keep you in the hospital anymore. I mean, you're just in and out. I heard of a lady not very long ago. She had a baby in the morning. They sent her home that evening. Well, what, they used to stay in the hospital a week, something like that. But I had this knee replaced last year. I had it done in the morning. I was home by supper time. And I keep thinking, well, no, they don't want you to stay in the hospital anymore. So anyway, Did you know that ancient people, biblical people at that time, they believed that your shadow was just an extension of your body? That they were together, they were kind of one in the same. One of the laws, there's a lot of laws that they had to live by back then, but one of the laws was you can't touch a dead body. You can't do that. If you just barely touch a dead body in their time, they thought then you're unclean, and you couldn't go to the temple or the synagogue until you went through this whole rigmarole of stuff and got clean again and could go back. So they thought your shadow had some power. If that shadow went across a dead body, okay, you're unclean. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Emperor. This is about at the end of the war, World War II, and the Emperor Hirohito, it was about him. And I like war movies and stuff like that, and I found it very fascinating because at the end of the war, General Douglas MacArthur, he wanted to meet the Emperor. Of course, he kind of thought, he's a pretty big guy, and he was in a lot of respects. But he made arrangements to go meet the Emperor. Not many people got to do that back then. But before he went in to meet the Emperor, his staff told him that we've got some rules here. First of all, you cannot touch him. Well, I guess like Queen Elizabeth, when she was alive, that was one of the rules. You don't shake hands with her unless she sticks her hand out first. And some people made some mistakes and got in trouble with that. But anyway, they told MacArthur, said, you can't touch him. You cannot look him square in the eye. You cannot be taller than he is. When you go in, your head has to always be lower than the emperor's head. And then the fourth rule, you cannot step on his shadow. Even the Japanese people believe the shadow is an extension of our body. Well, I respect General MacArthur in a lot of ways, and he did some amazing things, but he broke every one of the rules. First thing he did, put his hand out and shake hands with the guy. He stood up there and looked him square in the eye. He made sure he was standing up tall. I guess he was a tall man, and he looked down on the emperor. And he even made sure that he stepped on his shadow. I don't know if that's disrespect or what. But anyway, many people couldn't get close enough to Peter for him to actually touch them and heal them. And they saw all these other people being healed. They wanted to be healed. So what they did, they'd get out there along the road. They'd figure out where he's going. And they'd get out along the road, and they'd look, where's the sun? Where's our shadow? Well, where's the best place to set for his shadow to go over them? Well, one way or another, Peter's shadow did something, and there were a lot of positive things happened, and a lot of people were healed. Now, how is your spiritual shadow affecting people? You know, in the Easter story that we read every year, as we read the whole story of Easter, we see that Peter, he played a pretty good-sized part in that whole story. And, well, he was one of the main characters. But Peter's literal shadow is talked about here in Scriptures, but his life shadow reached out even greater. We could do a study on the life of Abraham, for instance, and we could see what a giant shadow that man cast. We could go through the lives of Isaac and Jacob, and we could see how Grandpa and Dad's shadow affected them tremendously throughout their life. We know that Abraham was so respected that he's mentioned 70 times in the New Testament. He's mentioned so many times. They had that respect for him. They looked up to him. They learned from him and all of that. Here it is, 4,000 years later, and you still hear preachers preach about Abraham and the effect he had and the part he played in the kingdom of God. I think of in Hebrews where it talks about Abel, and it says, he's dead, but he still speaks. Even to this day, Abel is still speaking about being faithful to God. His shadow is still affecting us. I think about Naomi and Ruth. Naomi had a beautiful shadow. Naomi changed Ruth's life. At a lot of weddings I've been to, and on a few of them that I have performed, you will hear about Ruth and Naomi. And you will hear the words, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried." And she says, "May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates me from you." We use that at weddings, but that's her words. She's still casting her shadow down to this year. And she's been gone a long time, but still has an influence. I'm thinking of the words that are found here in 2 Timothy, first chapter. I want to read verses 3 to 5. 2 Timothy, chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. "I thank God, whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. As night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers, recalling your tears. I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy." Now, Paul's writing this to Timothy, and then he goes on. He said, "I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also." Grandma Lois, she lived on through her grandson. And her mom, Eunice, she lived on through her son. Timothy had quite a shadow too. He went with Paul on some of his missionary journeys, and he learned of Paul everywhere he went, learned from him. Timothy ended up going to Ephesus to live there in the last part of his life. And he preached Christ and tried to start a church there and keep it going and all. But there were a lot of pagans in that city, and really sinful pagans, anti-God pagans. And he tried to preach against them and tell them the gospel to get them to turn around, but they didn't listen. One day, these pagans were having this big celebration. They had this big parade and very paganistic activities going on. The men all dressed up in costumes. They put masks on. Timothy came out to try to stop it and tell them it's wrong what they were doing and saying and all of this. Those men attacked him right there in the street, and they killed him right there in front of everyone and just left him there. Timothy was faithful till the day he died, but his shadow lingers on as well. I'm thinking of Paul, and there were so many young people. He invested his life in young people, and there were so many in his life and walked in his shadow. There was Timothy and Titus and Silas and Epaphras and Luke. Well, there's 19 different young men that are listed in Scriptures who went with him on the various missionary journeys. But then we read on and we see that Paul lists another 16 young men who were, he said, co-workers or fellow prisoners. His example, his writings, his teachings, they've touched millions of people down through the years until right today, and he's touching us. A good shadow is so important. Now, these people I've mentioned, because of their example in teaching and love, they affected unknown numbers of people, and they continue to do so. I like history, and I loved reading about a couple of guys, a father and son, by the name of Thomas and Alexander Campbell. Now, they helped start what we call the Restoration Movement. of which we are a part. Our roots go back to them. And joining them was a guy by the name of Barton Stone and Raccoon John Smith. He was quite a guy. And there were others. I wish that we taught in our churches more about our history and about the Restoration Movement and how it started. It is so rich of a story, and it caused the greatest revival meeting across this country at the time. It was just unbelievable, all of the things that happened. But we walk in the shadows of those guys. They've affected us in a very, very positive way, even though a lot of the members of the Christian churches today, they don't know that. They've never been taught. I read a lot about three guys, a fellow by the name of William Ingraham and William Reed and John Rogers. That's three farmers. They came in here from out of state, and they started the little town of Ingraham. And they started the Ingraham Christian Church 184 years ago. They were here. Now these men, I've read about them and how they wanted to pass on the gospel. That group of men in the early years of that church started 17 churches in our area. They were very evangelistic, and they wanted to spread the gospel. But there's so many living in those guys' shadows, and they don't even know it. Well, they did while I was over there and teaching and telling about our ancestors. Now, I don't know about the history of your congregation here. By the way, can anybody tell me what year this church started? Anybody know? Well, it's been a long time ago, whatever it was. And just as those three guys in Ingraham, they were affected by the teachings and preaching of the Campbells. They heard of them, and they were affected by them. And I know this congregation, whoever the founding fathers were, whatever time it was, especially if it had been 100 years ago, I know that they were affected by these other men. So that means you live in the shadow of them as well. I want to ask you to do something for me, and don't be bashful. I see this in the Christian churches. People tend to be bashful, and they don't want to say anything or do anything. I'm going to ask you to do something, and I believe you'll do it. I want you to think of the person in your life that you believe was most responsible for you becoming a Christian. Now, I know, like in my life, there were several people that was a part of me becoming a Christian. But think, who would you say, if you had to boil it down to one person, who was that one person? Now, I'm going to count to three, and I simply want you to say out loud all together the first name of that person. See, that's not hard. Okay? Got somebody in mind? 1, 2, 3. Dad. Okay. You are walking in the shadow of that person. That person cared enough for you and loved you enough to share the plan of salvation, to read the Bible to you, share the stories, whatever, to be there when you needed somebody. They cared about you. They loved you. You are walking in their shadow today. How many are walking in your shadow? Maybe more than what you think. But we are to have that same positive impact on those around us, both young and old. I want to tell you a story of something that happened. My aunt, Juanita Miller, she passed away 10 years ago. Juanita, I imagine she was here at one time or another. She was 11 years older than me, but she was like my older sister. I used to say she was my big sister, and then I quit doing that because she only stood about that tall. So she wasn't my big sister, but I used to call her my older sister. She, for 20 years, worked over at the Olney Hospital, head of pediatrics. And she's kind of spunky. Nobody crossed her. She had a lot of love for the parents of the children and the children. But more than once, she put a doctor in his place when he wasn't doing what he ought to be doing. But anyway, in high school, she had a dream. She wanted one day to grow up and be a medical missionary. She wanted to go to Africa as a trained nurse and help the folks out there that really needed help. Well, lo and behold, in the 1970s, the doors opened up, thanks to Larry Doggett and Nancy and others, and Juanita got to go to what then was called Zaire to be a medical missionary. It's called the Congo today, but had a tremendous ministry over there for 20 years. I can tell you all kinds of stories about that, but I won't. The time came, and all of our missionaries, they were run out of the country. And we had I think around 30 missionaries there at the time. But so they wouldn't be killed, they all had to leave the country. Well, Juanita wanted her work to continue. So instead of just coming home, she made the arrangements, the doors opened up, that she went to Mozambique to do basically the same thing she'd been doing for 20 years in Zaire. And she went to Mozambique to minister. 25 years as a servant of God in the medical field in Africa. Many wonderful things were said about her at the visitation and at the funeral, and have been since. Several people talked about the impact of her life on them. But I think the greatest tribute to her happened during the 2 or 3 weeks surrounding her death and burial. And I still can't believe that this happened. I'm still in awe of it today. Each person I'm going to mention here in just a little bit, they made all of their plans without knowing the other ones were making their plans. These were all individual things that were happening. But my sister was brokenhearted that she could not be here for Juanita's funeral. But Mary Kay and her husband Terry, they took a group of 9 students from Lincoln Christian University to Connecticut on a mission trip at that time. My son, he could not be here for the services because he was leaving for Uganda on a mission trip. My older daughter, she was able to be there for the funeral, or for the visitation, but she left shortly thereafter because she had to get home because she was going on a missionary trip to the Dominican Republic. My younger daughter and husband, they were able to be there for the visitation and the funeral, but when they left, they had to get back home to finish their preparation to go out to California, and they participated in one of these walks for water. I forget how long they walked. The main guy walked all the way across the country, but they were trying to raise $1.5 million so they could drill wells for people that didn't have any water in Kenya. And as a matter of fact, it was like 2 or 3 years later, they got to fly to Kenya, and they got to see 1 or 2 of those wells that were dug, and the people that finally had fresh water in their lives. I'm convinced God orchestrated that, because it was Juanita's, her shadow, her influence, that influenced my family members to want to be involved in mission work. Yes, at that time, still now, but at the time of her funeral, yes, she was dead. But her influence was being felt in Connecticut, in the Dominican Republic, in Uganda, and in Kenya. What a tribute. Now, there's one other shadow I want to mention. We'll wrap this up. Every one of us, we're walking in the shadow of the cross. Every one of us is walking in the shadow of the cross. As Christians, as children of God, we stand right there with Jesus. Hopefully we see that fact. We're going to have the Lord's Supper pretty soon. When we do, I hope you're thinking, I'm standing in the shadow of the cross. When you read your Bible, I hope that thought goes through your mind, I'm standing in the shadow of the cross. When you pray, I hope that thought goes across your mind. If you're in a youth meeting or a Sunday school class or whatever, when we meet, we are standing in the shadow of the cross. There's a painter by the name of Hoffman Hunt, very famous fella, has a very famous painting. In the painting, it shows Jesus at the door of the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. He's still a young boy. There's the setting sun that is shining through the door behind him. He's just a boy. Jesus comes to the door and he puts his hands out like this on both sides of that door. And as the sun is shining from behind him, you know what you can see in front of him. There's a shadow of a cross. And then over to the side is a depiction of his mother Mary, and she sees the shadow, and there is the fear in her eyes of the tragedy that's going to affect Jesus, her son. You see, Jesus came into this world to live for you and I, for everyone. And she knew that. The Lord had revealed that to her. And there she sees that tragedy. You can see it in her eyes. Jesus came into the world to live for men and women, and in the end, he had a mission to fulfill, and that was to die on the cross. He came to give his life for each one of us. Let me bounce back to where I started here real quick. Somebody invested their love and their concern and their time and their praying and their teaching into our lives. Somebody brought us to the Lord. We owe that person a lot, and really all those that played a part in it. We stand in their shadows today. And faithful people started this congregation many years ago. Faithful people have attended here down through the years. We are in the shadow of those people. We knew some of them. We probably didn't know all of them. Because of what these special people did in our lives, we have an obligation to share that good news with others. The new generation that's coming up, we owe them because what we need to, that we owe these other people. And there was Paul. He stood in the shadow of many people. Many people stand in his shadow, we included. Let's never forget that the church's ministry is in the shadow of the cross. Let's never forget our personal life and ministry is in the shadow of the cross. And as long as we remember this, Christ lives through us and through those that we reach with the gospel. We're going to be done, and you're going to go outside here in just a little bit. And none of us is going to see our shadow out there today. Too many clouds. But yet, I hope as you go out, because of this message and your time here today, that you will think of someone's shadow that you're walking in. And even more so, I hope you'll think about your shadow and ask God to make it as effective as possible. May my shadow touch as many people as possible. And may they see Jesus living in me every day. Father, I thank you for our time together. I thank you for what you have done, for what Jesus has done, for what your followers, both in the Old Testament and the New, have done. I thank you for present day people who are letting their light shine for you. And I just pray that you will find us faithful all the days of our lives. And I pray that everyone here will one day hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I pray that your Spirit will continue to work in and through the Brown Christian Church. I pray that the light of the gospel and the message of Jesus will continue to shine brightly. And I pray that because of these folks here, that those baptismal waters will be stirred again and again and again and again. Father, while we have breath in our body, please use us to your glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Ron.